Hi everyone, and welcome to the TGCon 2020. My name is Nancy Scharlach, and I'm the President and Chief Technical Director for FSMA International. I'm also a Lead Instructor for Preventive Controls for Human Food, a Lead Instructor for Foreign Supplier Verification Programs, Lead Instructor for International HACCP Alliance, and also a Registered SQF Consultant for High Risk Processing. Today's topic we're going to discuss is inside the mind of a food safety auditor, and let's get going. So some key topics that we're going to discuss today is we're going to focus on what some of those typical audit questions and areas that auditors focus on with regards to HACCP, FSMA preventive controls, training, and record keeping. The second part of the presentation, we're going to discuss kind of out of the box areas about auditing and some of the examples I have from traveling globally and sharing some of those experiences domestically, internationally, and some of those areas that I look at personally as I go through and audit facilities for FSMA compliance, food safety compliance in general. The last thing, I am going to share examples, show pictures, and share how, even though third-party audits take place, there are definitely facilities out there, manufacturing, that is not prepared for audits, that they tend to slide in certain areas, audit failures, unprepared suppliers worldwide. And so I'm going to share some examples of that so you can get an idea of what other auditors may look for besides a traditional third-party audit, especially a GFSI audit. So with that said, we're going to start with topic A, and that's looking at typical auditing questions and areas that auditors look for. A lot of you guys have already been exposed to many audits in your career. You've seen, the typical formula, if you will, where auditors come through and ask specific questions. Sometimes they have new questions each year. But there definitely is some different focus now with FSMA preventive controls. There's training requirements that might have changed. There's food fraud that might have changed. And of course, the record keeping is always a huge part of that. So really, audits do create a better food safe environment for manufacturing. We know that. We're never going to go away from doing third-party audits. They're extremely important in our industry. They keep our manufacturing plants continuously improving and aware of what the new regulations may be, the new topics that are important in food safety. These audit schemes are evolving and improving all the time, and we're adding new criteria to GFSI, for instance, every couple of years. So third-party audits are prescriptive, they're benchmarked, they're accredited and professionally executed worldwide to ensure a safer food supply. They have a real purpose in our industry. And audits really do elevate food safety compliance in the food industry, as suppliers are certified typically with that GFSI third-party certification. And so they really do serve a huge purpose in our industry. It's important that we keep up with the scheme that we work on, keep ourselves educated, attend conferences and webinars, and really understand how these audit schemes are implemented in our facilities. The outcome of these particular audits do push improved compliance over time. They do have shared benefits across the world. So for purchasing ingredients and products from around the world, it is really important that we choose a facility and a partner and a supplier that has been benchmarked with a third-party audit. It gives us more confidence in the industry and their compliance with food safety in general. Now, what third-party audits typically focus on? Again, a lot of you have already gone through this. Many times. We've done third-party audits for many years, and global food safety has been out for a long time as well now. It's a mature program that we're kind of used to seeing. But typically what the auditors are still focusing on is SOPs, your FSMA food safety plan, if that's what your scope is. It still could be HACCP, depending if you're a USDA plant, seafood or fish, seafood, or juice. They focus on training and record keeping, of course, and that always is evolving as you add new programs and things. So you definitely have to keep up with all of that. Some of the areas, again, they want to ensure all your SOPs are written according to the audit scheme. So if you're doing BRC or if you're doing FSSE or SQF, might be slightly different. But according to what scheme you have in your operations, of course, they want to look at all of those, make sure that you're complying with the actual code. Ensure that your food safety plans are written and the elements are presented and verified, and in some cases validated as well. Validation is starting to become more predominant. Auditors are becoming more savvy on asking what is being validated in your facility. Are they CCPs, preventive controls? Controlling food safety hazards is what it's about. How are you doing that? What's the science behind it? And those are some of those areas that they're starting to focus on as well. The auditors are really focused on ensuring your CCPs, preventive controls, and other food safety controls are present, recorded, and provided and fully implemented, of course, because those are the biggest food safety areas are your CCPs and preventive controls. And so that's one of the areas that really started focusing on, especially the last couple of years with the preventive controls. Ensure that your required records are proving that the program is fully implemented and adequate resources are employed to manage the food safety program. So I've seen a lot of auditors as well really focus on the resources, the SQF practitioner, for example, their backup, who's responsible, senior management, do you have regular meetings? Do you document those meetings properly? And again, are they part of your KPIs at the annual management meeting? So these are areas that are very common that auditors are focusing on, because without the right resources and commitment, the culture is not there. They can sense that, and then they want to see the proof as they go through the audit. They also want to ensure training for all employees is there. Part of the new FSMA regulation is having those qualified individuals trained in the respected job responsibility. And so they really are focusing on the job itself, the job descriptions, who's doing what, and of course the compliance there with training and documenting all of your training. So that's a big hot topic, especially with the new FSMA regulations, PCQIs and so forth as well. Crisis and CAPA controls. These are still a big topic right now when it comes to audits, because corrective and preventative actions is a foundation of ensuring continuous improvement, making sure that, okay, you made a mistake. How did you fix it? You didn't let it get out of control. You're moving on. And so therefore, the auditors still do focus a lot on CAPAs. If you've made a mistake in your program throughout the year, that's okay. I mean, we make mistakes in our programs itself, but we do have to correct them. And auditors are starting to really focus on making sure that you're doing the homework and the follow through what it takes. The other part is the facility grounds and equipment operations. A lot more time is being spent out on the production floor. So facilities and grounds, good hygienic condition for your operations. These are all really, really important to make sure that you're operating with good hygiene. And obviously you put your best foot forward. You have good conditions. You're going to do well in your audit. Ensure manufacturing operations, and GMPs are fully executed and following company GFSI and regulatory requirements. That is really important because, again, it might vary from facility to facility depending on what type of operation you are. Are you high risk or are you low risk? That will generate a decision from the auditor on how they're going to view your operations. And so obviously the higher the risk you are, the more they're going to expect to see compliance, hygiene, layering on those prerequisite programs to help mitigate food safety issues in the plant and cross-contamination, cross-contact, things like that. So again, it depends on what you're processing, but it's really important to focus on what are you processing and how are you mitigating risk in the operation and building itself. I can tell you right now, I'm going to show some examples as we go forward why this is such an important topic, because paperwork isn't everything. It's how you execute your operations and the level of hygiene in the facility that really drives the food safety. And that's what auditors are starting to pick up on. That's what I personally look at when I go across internationally, especially how you are implementing, perceiving, and culturally integrating these food safety programs into the facility. The last thing is ensuring equipment is approved, adequate, and safe for food manufacturing. I see a lot of failures in this area. There's a lot of equipment out there. There's a lot of fabrication, making your own, especially worldwide. Does it really comply with food safety requirements? and good food processing practices? Does it promote cross-contamination or cross-contact? It's one of those areas that I really look at. And again, I'm going to show you some pictures to that as well. Okay, so the top audit topics that third-party audits are focused on, it can vary from scheme to scheme and from auditor depending on their experience and where they've worked in their past. Some of the areas that they focus on in their past jobs can trickle over into their perception as an auditor as well. So really, this is hard to really dial in on what every auditor is going to focus on, but typically the hottest topics are these. And of course, your HACCP and food safety plan is going to be number one. This should be number one because this is your foundation to make sure that you're controlling food safety hazards. That's what food safety is all about. We want to mitigate hazards. We want to ship unadulterated and wholesome food. And so they are going to be looking at your components of your HACCP plan, making sure that it's all there, that it's, checking the list to make sure that the scheme, what did you miss? Of course, we've all been through that and understand that, they really do focus on that area pretty much the most in the audit, I think. They obviously look at CCPs and preventive controls now, because again, these are the areas that show and prove if your food safety is being controlled properly. And if you're missing key things in your HACCP or food safety plan, and you're missing the record keeping and the monitoring and the verification elements of a CCP or preventive control, then you truly are not proving that you're controlling food safety hazards properly. So again, they're going to look at those areas very carefully. The allergen preventive control is becoming a hot topic. It is 1/3 of all the recalls right now in the industry. And so of course that should be an area that we're looking at. Are you controlling your allergen management system properly? Is it outlined in your food safety plan for FSMA if it's required? Are you doing your label reviews properly? Are you changing over properly? Are you swabbing properly? Are you visually monitoring the lines properly? Are you separating your functions? These are the areas where, there's a lot of layers to controlling allergens, and there's not just one particular program that's going to work. It's going to take many different layers to really control a unique allergen situation when you have more than one. Auditors are starting to really pick up and look at that. Another big one is the environmental monitoring program. Again, if you have ready-to-eat food and you're shipping ready-to-eat food to the public, you're required to put a sanitation preventive control for FSMA. If you're regulated under FSMA, you have to have that sanitation preventive control in place. And so, what mitigates and reduces the risk of environmental pathogens? Sanitation. So proper and adequate sanitation is one of those areas that, again, has many layers, like an allergen preventive control, pre-ops, chemical control, approved chemicals, methodology of cleaning equipment. These are all areas that need to be very robust if you have ready-to-eat food, especially. Should be robust anyway. And these are the areas that auditors are really starting to pick up on, once again, because of the FSMA regulation. We're changing the climate a little bit, and we're looking at different areas and diving deeper into asking, interviewing employees, looking at how the methods, your auditors come at different hours, of course, to see how you're doing your sanitation program. So what your master sanitation look like. Again, these are all areas that the auditors are diving deep into. Supplier management is another one that is gaining a lot of traction, and is also because of the supply chain applied preventive controls. And there is subpart G of the regulation for human food talks about you have to have a supply chain program if it's necessary. And so it's not just required for GFSI and other third-party audits, also required under regulation now. And so FSMA does push even more of an importance on making sure your suppliers are being managed properly. If you're importing on the FSVP side, of course, you definitely have to have an FSVP program. If you're a manufacturer that imports, you have to have an FSVP program. I get that question a lot when I'm training and doing webinars. So once again, your auditors are focusing kind of where the trend is going in the regulation as well. Like the allergen, sanitation, supply chain preventive controls are looking at those areas more carefully. And of course, I mentioned earlier, CAPAs, corrective and preventive action, very important. Calibration and proficiency is still a hot topic. If your instruments, if your people, your employees are not doing things properly, if they're not measuring and doing the testing and observations adequately, then you're not really doing yourselves any, complying basically with what you're supposed to be doing in your HACCP or food safety plan. So the calibration and proficiency side is gaining a lot of traction, especially with edition 8 and 8.1 that came out in SQF. Proficiency testing is part of that. And it's definitely one of the hotter topics that you see and auditors asking in-depth questions about proficiency. Food fraud has been gaining traction for a couple of years now. There's tons of information about food fraud. It's in all the GFSI benchmark scope now, schemes. And of course, intentional adulterations out there for FSMA. And of course, intentional adulteration, food fraud, and all the schemes. And then economically motivated hazards in your FSMA food safety plan has also driven some awareness around the food fraud aspect. So once again, they're looking at your plan and making sure that that you have a foundation of food fraud in your actual audit as well. So some of the questions that auditors still ask, and again, we've seen a lot of these questions, they're repeated year after year. It's a lot of work to keep training your employees to make sure that they're informed and educated on, what scheme, what third-party audit you're doing. But once again, there's some key top questions that your auditors will look for and ask certain employees. And some of them are, what would you do if a metal detector was alerted? Show me how you do your calibration wands or how this works. Show me the rejection. How do you challenge your metal detector is another question, part of the validation side. What allergens are in your facility? They'll ask employees this off the line. A lot of you know this, so prepare all of your employees. How do you know which ingredients are allergens? And so some of you employees get tripped up and they don't even know which allergens are in the facility or how you manage them. That may be a problem because you're not driving that culture of food safety in your plant if your key areas like allergens, sanitation, GMPs, hygiene are not being trained and educated to your employees. So be aware that you need all your employees on board with some of these questions. When do you wash your hands? Give us 3 examples. That's a very common question you see with auditors as well. How do you know that your supplier is approved? And what would you do if an unapproved supplier showed up at the receiving dock? I get that question a lot. I ask it a lot. It's one of those areas that you need to understand if an ingredient that is from an unapproved supplier shows up, somebody should be aware of that and they should be trained properly. Your employees should understand that. And be able to reject it or do some sort of, corrective action with the supply chain and quality side of your business, or the purchasing side. There is a clause for emergency suppliers, and they should be well aware of that. And so those are questions that auditors ask as well. What happens if the equipment is dirty during a pre-op? So going out and looking and asking, hey, what do you do if this is not clean? And do you shut the line down? They want to hear what employees are trained to do for pre-op. And pre-op is one of the most important areas in your manufacturing setting. You cannot start a line up when it's dirty, filthy, evidence of allergens, for example, as well. Those are areas that would really drive poor performance in food safety, and non-compliance, of course, as well, could cause cross-contamination, cross-contact. So again, your employees should really understand how to conduct a pre-op properly using flashlights and visual inspections and swabbing, and also being brave enough to shut the line down or speak up to a supervisor and not just, business as usual, release the line even though it shouldn't have been. I get that a lot, where employees are afraid to speak up and they're not quite sure, they're not confident in what they're supposed to be doing. And auditors want to see confidence. They want to They want to make sure your employees feel like they're, confident in their position that they're supposed to be in. So if you're a pre-op inspector, they should be highly trained and understand what the next steps would be. And of course, show me the paperwork and all the documentation, especially with the pre-op side. All right, so switching topics to other areas in auditing. So these are kind of the areas that I focus on when I do my audits worldwide and go overseas, especially, even domestically as well. But it's not a repeat of a GFSI audit, and so I definitely have focus on other areas that I look at, just knowing that there are weaknesses in these areas. So other areas or approaches to food safety audits, not following the typical audit schemes. So when I personally go out and audit manufacturing plants, I take a slightly different approach because I'm not there to do another GFSI audit. I'm there to dig deep into other areas like how are they controlling true food safety hazards? How does their paperwork match up to their operations and their employee awareness and execution of everything? And so again, not there to do another GFSI audit. I am focused on truly controlling food safety hazards through their evidence in their operations and their management teams. Are they using approved suppliers properly, their customer practices, all of these areas that are almost not neglected in a GFSI audit, but not looked at as deeply as I do when I go and do an audit myself. So these are just some areas and tips that I look at. I think it's important that we all look at this in our operations to make sure, and our suppliers as well, are you really controlling food safety hazards properly, and really focus on that question will help. So when I look at food safety hazard control, the approach that I take is make sure you read the hazard analysis line by line and evaluate, did they identify hazards properly? So are they also outlining the control measures properly? So are they naming everything correct? Is it generic? Do they, for example, just say the word pathogens? Well, pathogens could be lots of different things, right? It could be vegetative pathogens, it could be environmental pathogens, spore-forming pathogens. They all have slightly different control measures to them. And so if your hazard analysis is weak, generic, it doesn't give you the right information, then that generates an element of weakness in their general food safety controls. And so I start with the hazard analysis. I really dive in. I get my red pen out, of course, and you really dive into that. And of course, your suppliers as well. So if you're reviewing a supplier, you're looking at, hey, are they controlling hazards properly? Read the hazard analysis carefully. Don't just look for, okay, they've got the basics in there. Are they naming pathogens? Are they naming the allergens properly? Do they have the names of the allergens in there? Because how do you know if there's shared equipment with allergens, and do they need to change over? That tells me if they have soy, wheat, dairy, or milk in the same facility. I want to see sanitation controls. I want to see the right control measures to mitigate that hazard. But if they don't write it properly and it's generic and it doesn't tell me the story that I'm looking for, I'm not able to have confidence right off the bat that a supplier is controlling those allergen changeovers properly. If they can't identify it in their hazard analysis where it should be, how do I know if further down the process and further down the controls that they're doing and executing this properly? So, there are different control measures for all these different hazards. Make sure that the hazards are there, they're detailed, they're not generic, and then focus on how they're controlling those hazards. That will tell you a good foundational story if they understand their own operations when it comes to food safety hazard control, okay? Now, are the CCP's process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain preventive controls, again, fully addressed in that hazard analysis? Are they outlined? Are they executed? Are they specific to food safety hazards? Okay, many of the HACCP and food safety plans that I come across as an auditor are missing the connection between the hazard analysis and implementing the right control measures. And again, I give that example of unique allergens on the line. So you have multiple allergens on the line. You should have proper sanitation preventive controls on the hazard analysis saying, here's what we do to control those unique allergens. Another example, I have spore-forming bacteria. Here's my cooling procedure or temperature controls that actually control the outgrowth of spore formers. So again, there's very specific control measures to specific hazards. If it's not there, then you know that there's some sort of gap in maybe their knowledge or maybe even in their programs itself. So I always look for the one area that I look for the most, I think, is looking at environmental pathogens. Do they address environmental pathogens on their hazard analysis? Because that is one of the biggest areas that I personally see as an auditor that's a weakness in the manufacturing side, in their equipment, the lack of sanitation, lack of awareness, lack of pre-ops. That drives an increase of risk for environmental pathogens and ready-to-eat food. And so that is one of the areas that I truly look for. And I can say that 90% of hazard analyses out there that I review for my business, that I review as an auditor, it lacks the environmental pathogen identification and control. So definitely focus on those areas, especially if you're purchasing ready-to-eat food. Even if you're not, and you want to make sure that they're doing their proper sanitation and they're identifying, what could happen in operations, focus on it as well. Okay, so switching gears again to the last part of the presentation is I'm going to share some examples and experiences with audit failures and unprepared suppliers worldwide. And, pictures always tell 1,000 words. We know that. So I definitely like to present and teach and utilize photos to train and help everybody understand what I'm looking at. And so you can see the evidence and why I would pick out something as an issue or nonconformance in an audit. So here is an example of a hazard breakdown, control breakdown. And so let me give you a background on the supplier. They have been GFSI certified for 6 years. They did have a HACCP and food safety plan. Once again, they did not address environmental pathogens. They did not address sanitation preventive controls. It was a very generic hazard analysis. And so once I looked at that initially as an auditor, it was a red flag to say, man, I hope when I go out into the production floor that I'm able to, be impressed by their operations and their awareness. But it truly was the opposite. And it kind of, in my experience over all these years, that's usually how it goes. If you see a weak hazard analysis and a weak food safety or HACCP plan, typically you're going to see a weak operation setting because they just don't understand the link between them and how important it is to follow what you write down in your HACCP or food safety plan. And so really the supplier was unaware of the sanitation breakdown and the lack of hazard control in the operation. And their HACCP, it was there, it was passable in a third-party audit. But once again, in my approach as an auditor, I look at detail in that hazard analysis, and that's what they were lacking. So as you can see in these pictures, the first picture right there, you can see the black biofilms and the blue conveyor belt. I can actually say that I felt like that plant may have never even washed or cleaned and sanitized that equipment ever. It looked like it was months and months of neglect. And this was ready to eat frozen food. And so, you look at the risk level and you look at the level of compliance, obviously there's a huge breakdown here. The second picture again is biofilm. So the big trend that I see is that, companies that lack the detail in their food safety and HACCP plans and their programs in general are lacking in the operational side. And you can see the evidence that points to that. And that's why I'm showing you these pictures and showing you the case study, because there was a huge breakdown. And their HACCP plan was average, it was generic, but it definitely showed in operations that their culture in their company wasn't quite robust enough. They didn't have either the education, the motivation, or understanding, or didn't really realize that this was such a huge problem until somebody else pointed it out. And then the last picture is, again, ready to eat food running on their line. And you can see the biofilms there as well, and the lack of sanitation and the lack of awareness around those environmental pathogens, which should have been in their hazard analysis and in their food safety plan, talked about sanitation controls and methods of mitigating their environmental pathogens. So again, focus on the real hazards when you're doing an audit. If you're doing internal audits, if you're looking at suppliers around the world, domestically, internationally, doesn't matter. Look at all the hazards itself. Don't just focus on, it looks complete. Dive deep into how they're controlling hazards. That's really a good secondary approach besides that GFSI audit to make sure that we're all, world class and we're doing everything we're supposed to do. This is how making sure that the supplier proves that all the hazards are being controlled properly, naming their hazards, how they're controlling them in their operations. These are the biggest failures that I see in a plant in manufacturing setting right now as an auditor. And again, I'm showing another example of a breakdown. These are GFSI audited facilities. You can see on the left, they got creative about their equipment. So, lack of good equipment, good utensils, surfaces, areas that they get creative. There was no real sense of urgency with management. When I was walking around doing the audit itself and looking at this equipment that was substandard and basically not approved really for food contact, And of course, you can see the other two pictures are hollow legs, which is an area that I really look at because you can see on the third picture the biofilms coming right out as soon as you pick up the table. Those hollow legs generate a lot of environmental pathogen concerns, especially in ready-to-eat foods. So be aware of your weaknesses in equipment with your own production facilities, and of course your suppliers and auditors. You going out there and doing your own audits on your suppliers as well. It is really important to focus on these little niche areas and weaknesses. Those are the things that can cause the big problems and potential outbreaks that can happen in a facility. It's not how beautiful your certificate looks on the wall. It's not your beautiful manuals that are sitting in the office. It is the actual real food safety going on in the production area and the equipment compliance that is really about food safety. Again, poor equipment design causes biofilms, lack of adequate sanitation. They do have creative ways of making equipment these days worldwide, so just be aware of that when it comes to yourselves and your suppliers as well. Another example of hazard control breakdown is the building itself. It's amazing to me that I still see, as an auditor myself worldwide, the lack of building construction compliance. Again, GFSI certified facilities that on the left-hand picture, it's hard to see. Hopefully you guys can see it. There's a couple birds up there that are perching at the top. And when you walk into a building where they're literally doing produce and putting it on the floor, as you can see in the second picture, and you walk around and see birds flying all over the place, and you're wondering, and you look around and there's open doors everywhere, but yet they're processing food, and you're going, I don't understand. And so as an auditor, you don't take things for granted. You really do have to dissect every area of buildings, equipment, paperwork, employee practices, culture. I mean, these are all areas that you really need to focus on. This was a recent audit I did this year in 2020. So this is not from years ago. A facility that's GFSI certified for 6 years really should understand this a little better. So, these areas that are basic we're still seeing breakdown. And this is where food safety is real. Putting stuff on the floor is unacceptable. And so, you have to secure buildings. You have to have good equipment. You have to have awareness with management. One of the problems I noted was that the fact that, the management team didn't really do anything when I walked in their bird. So again, you have to look at all aspects as an auditor and understand that, it takes many layers to look at to show really the big picture when it comes to compliance. It's not just maybe an obvious situation. There could be lots of different reasons why you see breakdowns. The doors are not secured. They were cutting produce with the doors wide open, like I said. There were hundreds of crates on the floor. So these are, once again, case studies of breakdowns in real food safety and areas that auditors like myself look at outside the box. I know that auditors still look at this even from a third-party perspective, but again, the more eyes and the more education, the more we can do to show that there are other areas besides your typical code prescriptive areas that really need to be focused on. That's really the key to real food safety in your operations, like I said. Okay, other tips to focus on when you're auditing. So besides looking at your hazard analysis and looking at your supplier's hazard analysis, these are the areas that, once again, I focus on when I go and audit facilities. I look at the allergen preventive control. Why? Once again, it's new, it's a regulation. We have to have allergen preventive controls and FSMA plans, which is most of the plans these days now. We still have HACCP. In certain areas like USDA, seafood, and juice. But you must look at unique allergens. You must make sure that they're being addressed in the hazard analysis. And of course, what are all the programs that are in place to mitigate chances of allergen cross-contamination, cross-contact? How are they controlling these unique allergens? What methods? Is it written? Is there verification? Is there monitoring? What are their swabbing methods? Swabbing is not all equal, using a generic protein, using an AllerSnap, for example, or using ATP. Which one is the right swabbing methods? International companies have a lot harder time understanding to really drive awareness around allergens. And not all, but I see a lot of weaknesses in these areas because, they're trying to catch up with our regulation. And so understanding what our United States allergen preventive control requires is a lot of more education and awareness and a lot more paperwork. And so these are areas that I find to be weak. And so I really focus in on controlling these hazards and allergens and unique allergens. Sanitation preventive controls, again, what sanitation methods are used? I see a lot of facilities that are not using detergents when they are fulfilling their sanitation practices. And so they'll just skip using a detergent or soap and only use a sanitizer like chlorine because it's really cheap. This is a problem. This is why you see biofilms. This is why you see the pictures I showed you with the black on the conveyor belt. When you don't use detergents, it's like not, you skipping brushing your teeth and just using mouthwash. So when I'm out there auditing and teaching, I talk about brushing your teeth and then using mouthwash. So unfortunately, a lot of facilities are for some reason skipping this detergent agitation step in sanitation, which only yields a really unsafe, unhygienic food processing environment. And so these are the areas, again, I focus on because I've seen so many trends of problems worldwide with this. I'm not doing a GFSI audit again, I'm focusing on those specific areas. Now, if the food is ready to eat, you're required to address environmental pathogens, you're required to have a sanitation preventive control in place. And once again, there's usually a breakdown between their hazard analysis and then addressing environmental pathogens and sanitation preventive controls. And so again, looking at those weaknesses, are they missing it? And then training, showing, educating, and basically requiring continuous improvement when it comes to these programs. Supply chain applied controls, once again, you have to have a supply chain program and a purchasing program for GFSI. FSMA took it to a little bit different approach where they said, if your supplier controls a hazard, you have to have a supply chain applied control. And if the hazard's high enough risk, right, likelihood and severity, then you have to put a supply chain control on them. And so I look for specifically which suppliers are controlling hazards for this particular audits going on, the supplier, and then what kind of documentation are you looking at and are you requiring from your suppliers when you approve them? And so you really kind of need to dig deep. And if it comes into where you need more than just an audit and a C of A, for example, from your supplier, you should be asking for, what kind of food safety documentation proves that your supplier is controlling those hazards. So for example, if I'm buying frozen broccoli from a supplier, and this is an example in our PCQI class a lot, if you're getting frozen broccoli from a supplier, then you probably should be asking for their environmental monitoring program and their sanitation, because Listeria monocytogenes is a high risk in frozen vegetables and frozen fruit. And so it's not just about asking for an audit and a C of A, it's proactive food safety and asking for the proactive programs, not a reactive program like a C of A. Not saying C of A's are bad, they definitely fit the purpose, but it's important that we look at proactive food safety. How do they mitigate that risk in the plant first before I receive that product? And that's what I focus on in an auditing situation. I focus on proactive food safety programs and how they're mitigating, not the after testing program at the end. We want to prevent in the first place. And that's what FSMA is about. It's about prevention. Okay, other tips to focus on when you're auditing. Focus on, again, operations, building equipment, how written programs are executed, the visual evidence and the link between the written program and how they're actually controlling those food safety hazards. A lot of times you're going to see a weakness or a gap between the written program and actual operations going on. And that's what I see the most as a weakness in most worldwide facilities. And again, documentation, emailed or uploaded, may not cover everything. If you're reviewing a foreign supply, you've got to make sure that maybe they're taking pictures for you. Maybe you do a FaceTime video for an hour as they walk around the facility, have them look at different areas and different equipment, get a good feel for how they're controlling hazards. Sometimes you can't see all this stuff on a desk audit, for example. And so my advice is, if you can't fly somewhere, of course, with the COVID climate right now and the travel restrictions, it makes it way more difficult. And so getting pictures, I like to do a FaceTime or some sort of video, Skyping where I can actually see the operations, get a look and feel, have them take the flashlight out there and really look at everything so that you can get a good understanding of how their culture is when you're doing an audit. And I know there's discussions right now about doing remote audits because of the COVID climate. So that's going to be an interesting topic as we evolve in this new era of traveling and on-site audits. Questions to ask the supplier. These are, do use a flashlight when you're doing your pre-ops and inspections, internal audits. When I show up with a high-powered flashlight, a lot of times you can see them getting nervous because they've never done that before, and all of a sudden you're seeing everything come out. It is so important that you ask and utilize a flashlight yourself within your own operations or at your supplier, because you cannot see these problems unless you use a flashlight. Again, what detergents are they using? What chemicals are they using in sanitation? Have them prove that they're actually using detergents, not just sanitizers. What are their methods of sanitation? How often do they conduct full wash downs and changeovers and things of that nature? These are really, really, these are the areas of weakness that I see in facilities worldwide, is the changeovers, the full wash downs, the type of chemicals, the methodology of sanitation. These are all areas that I see are usually the most nonconformances in. What unique allergens run on the same equipment? A lot of times they don't know what that means. So in a frozen fruit plant, for example, maybe they're doing edamame and they didn't even understand soy was an allergen. And so they left it out of the HACCP or food safety plan. So again, you may have to dig a little deeper, especially investigating, what products are running on shared equipment, which is a big deal. Once you share equipment, it becomes a unique situation and you have to have more programs in place. And what are the resources they're using for training? Are they USA equivalent, or what kind of training are the employees going through? Are there PCQIs on site? Are they going through the FSPCA equivalent of training? I see a lot of weaknesses worldwide on this as well, because of the fact that you may not get the true understanding what an allergen preventive control is or a sanitation preventive control if they're not going through our equivalent training systems in the United States. And there are plenty of classes available worldwide when it comes to FSMA and preventive controls. So I do highly recommend that you investigate that if you're looking at your suppliers and doing audits. Okay. So just more tips before we end here. There are many approaches to auditing a facility and operations, and a third-party auditors, they are fully trained, they're calibrated, they go through a lot of training, a lot of education to make sure they deliver the right product, and they do a great job. And they follow the schemes and document those nonconformances as well. However, because I do audit worldwide and I see a lot of different strengths and weaknesses in different foods and different countries and different areas, there are many breakdowns out there. And as an auditor, I do see that. I've experienced a lot of failures in current audited facilities, which is why it is important to kind of micromanage your suppliers from a HACCP and food safety plan standpoint. Really focus on, are they looking at their hazards properly? Are they identifying them properly? And are they controlling properly? Those are the kind of formulation I look at: identifying and controlling. And if you can really focus on that, then a lot of times you can kind of get through the weeds a little bit and focus on the right things if you have a short period of time, especially when you're on site. The breakdown of controlling food safety hazards, it can be lost for many reasons. Auditors and audits use different methods, different approaches. Different cultures around the world may interpret things differently. There's lots of reasons why we see breakdowns. We see them here in the United States and all over the world, really. But there are definitely, it's definitely a worldwide issue to see breakdowns. And again, it takes a lot of work to be able to keep your facility and operations, education, your employees, everything going properly, and continuous improvement is very difficult. So anyways, I highly recommend that you look at the food safety plan, the preventive controls, the CCPs, dive into the operations, make sure they're matching everything up properly, and use your technique of flashlights and your own experience to really drive home the question: are they controlling food safety hazards? And that's really what my approach is, other than the GFSI audits. So I just want to say thank you. We're going to have questions today, but I appreciate your attention and understanding with, audits are a very difficult thing to go through. We all do it. But if you can really continuously improve, educate your suppliers worldwide on the importance of hazard control, sanitation, allergens, supply chain. These are the hot topics right now. When it comes to FSMA and our new regulation, I'm seeing a lot of weaknesses worldwide around this. So the more education and the more requirements that we can put on our global suppliers, the better we're gonna be on the same playing field still, and the more continuous improvement we will see in compliance. So with that said, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your time and hope you have a good rest of your conference.